All right. So hopefully you guys can remember the major themes that we've been covering over the last couple of weeks since exam 2. So we talked about how organisms respond to their environment. We talked about how different taxa maintain homeostasis, so things like thermoregulation and osmoregulation. We talked about how different taxa acquire and process nutrients. And now we've been talking about how different taxa reproduce. So, as a reminder of the sort of big picture of what we're trying to figure out with reproduction, we've been talking about what reproduction is, so the definition of that term, and some general patterns in reproduction, specifically the ability of organisms to reproduce both sexually and asexually, and some of the trade-offs involved in sexual versus asexual reproduction. We've also been talking about the role meiosis and mitosis play in reproduction, and that sexual reproduction requires meiosis, and how sex and meiosis can enhance overall genetic variation in offspring. And so now we're going to move into this last sort of section, talking about variation that exists in reproductive strategies. And the first thing that we're going to talk about are life cycles. So it'll be an introduction to what a life cycle is and a few examples of different life cycles that we see in nature. We're going to talk about fertilization and dispersal as important aspects of reproduction for many organisms. And then lastly, we'll talk about some of the adaptations, the specific adaptations that organisms have evolved to aid in this fertilization and dispersal. So let's talk about life cycles, okay? So a life cycle is simply a cycle that an organism goes through during reproduction that involves dramatically different life stages. So the most common life cycle, or I guess maybe not the most common life cycle, or the one you might be most familiar with, is the human life cycle, okay? So remember, humans are animals, and this is very typical of the animal life cycle, where basically you've got a multicellular diploid stage that, humans live as for most of their life, okay? And then there's these sort of sex organs within the humans. You've got the ovaries and the testes, and within those sex organs, meiosis occurs to produce a different life stage, this haploid life stage that you see outlined in the sort of light blue, where these gametes, unicellular gametes, are produced. So you've got an egg produced by a female and a sperm produced by a male. Remember, these are haploid life stages. So meiosis cuts the ploidy in half from 2N to 1N to produce these gametes. And then an sperm will fuse with an egg during fertilization, and that will double the ploidy. And so you'll go from haploid to diploid to form this zygote, which then goes through mitotic divisions to form this diploid life stage, okay? So when I talk about life stages, what am I talking about? I'm talking about a human, so an adult is one life stage, and a gamete, an egg or a sperm, is a different life stage that human beings and other animals exist as, okay? So when we talk about types of life cycles, one way that you can sort of break life cycles up or organize them into what are called haploid versus diploid dominant life cycles. So human life cycle is a great example of what's called a diploid dominant life cycle. And all that diploid dominant means is that these organisms spend most of their life in the diploid stage. So remember, humans are animals, and this is very typical of the typical animal life stage. So animal life stages typically are diploid dominant life cycles, okay? And when I say diploid dominant, it just means that humans, like other animals, spend most of their life as this diploid multicellular stage, okay? So this diploid 2N life stage dominates the life cycle. Now this is in contrast to a haploid dominant life cycle, okay? So in haploid dominant life cycles, organisms that live in haploid or have haploid dominant life cycles spend most of their life in the haploid life stages. So a great example of this might be green algae, where you can see this plant here represents the life stage the green algae spends most of its life in, which is a multicellular organism, but it is in fact haploid. And so this multicellular organism will produce haploid egg and sperm through mitosis. Those egg and sperm will come together to fertilize to make this unicellular zygote that's a very short-lived life stage, which will then go through meiosis and cut the ploidy in half to make these spores that are haploid once again. And it'll spend a very short amount of time in these spores. You can kind of think of these sort of like seeds. They're different than seeds, but they're like seeds, in that these will go through mitosis a bunch of times and germinate and grow into this multicellular life stage that is in fact haploid. And this green algae will spend most of its life in this life stage. And so this is a haploid dominant life cycle because most of the algae's life is spent in that life stage. Okay, so given what we just learned in this example of a diploid dominant life cycle, which of the following is true of the typical animal life cycle? And remember that this life cycle that we're looking at here is representative of the typical animal life cycle. All right, so if you said C is the correct choice, you are right. So the diploid life stage is not unicellular. So this is the major diploid life stage. Yes, the zygote is unicellular, but just for a very, very brief period of time. The dominant diploid life cycle or life stage here is the adult human or the adult life stages, and even a young human that's not an adult yet, an adolescent human, is a multicellular organism, okay? And this is the diploid life stage. The haploid life stage here are the gametes like egg and sperm, and they are in fact unicellular. The gametes are produced by meiosis, that is true. These are the gametes, they are haploid, and they are produced by diploid diploid cells like testes and ovaries that go through meiosis to produce the gametes. And most of the life cycle is spent not in this haploid gamete phase. These are very short-lived, on the order of, hours to maybe days, whereas the diploid stage is the long-lived stage. And so this is, of course, humans, we can live to be, 100 plus years old. And so this is the dominant life cycle. This is where, the life stage, the most of the life cycle is spent is. And this is why it's called the diploid dominant life stage or life cycle. So remember, diploid dominant just means spending most of life in that diploid stage. And so in contrast, some organisms are haploid dominant. They spend the majority of their life in this haploid phase or life stage. And malaria is a great example of that. So earlier we talked about how algae are a great example of a haploid dominant life cycle. Let's talk about malaria now. So malaria, they are protists. Remember, these are unicellular eukaryotic organisms. Protists are unicellular eukaryotic organisms. And malaria is one example of a protist that kills, it has important health implications, whereas it can kill up to 3,000 children every day that are infected by and potentially die from malaria. It's a huge problem where greater than 200 million people in the world are sickened by malaria each year, and greater than 400,000 people die from it, most of whom are pregnant women or young children. And this is mostly caused by the single-celled protist Plasmodium falciparum. Now, there's other strains and other species of Plasmodium, but this is sort of the worst species of malaria. So what I want to do now is explore the life cycle of malaria, okay? And this is really just to teach you about a different type of life cycle than we see in humans and other animals, to teach you more about a haploid dominant life cycle. So we'll be working through this figure right here. Just looking at this figure, what you're looking at is anything in the blue side here are life stages that occur inside of a mosquito, where malaria spends a lot of its life. And anything that occurs here on the sort of pinkish peach color side are life stages of the malaria life cycle that occur in a human. And you can see some life stages are in a liver or liver cells or red blood cells. Anything that you see over here is happening inside of a mosquito. So let's explore this haploid dominant life cycle of malaria. So first, let's start with this little mosquito here that's bit a human, and this mosquito is in fact infected with malaria. So this infected mosquito bites a human, and it injects some haploid Plasmodium cells that you can see right here. These little things right here get injected by the mosquito, and these are haploid life stages. And these go on to infect a human liver cell and multiply inside that liver cell by mitosis. So the ploidy is not changing, and they're just making a lot of copies of themselves, asexually reproducing inside of these liver cells. And so if you go inside a liver and sort of blow it up and look at an individual liver cell, basically these sick or infected liver cells, eventually so many of these malaria parasites reproduce inside that liver cell that it bursts open and pops out all these little malaria cells that you're looking at right here. And these, once again, these are haploid life stages. And then these go from the liver cells out into the bloodstream. And so they'll go into the bloodstream and they'll start residing inside of red blood cells. So they'll infect red blood cells, and then they'll reproduce inside the red blood cells until the red blood cells pop. So what you're looking at right here is step 3A, and these little blue and yellow things, or green and yellow things, represent the malaria growing inside these pink things right here that represent red blood cells. And so once again, these cells are haploid. They reproduce by mitosis inside the red blood cells until the red blood cells get so thick full of them that they pop like a balloon. And this is really what causes people to die from malaria, is that they get so many of these malaria parasites inside the red blood cells that all the red blood cells pop. And when those red blood cells pop, obviously you can't transport oxygen around. And this is what causes people to get sick and die, is because they lose all their red blood cells. Okay, so these red blood cells burst. This is what causes the sickness in humans. But this also increases the amount of plasmodium in the bloodstream. And so now you can see a mosquito comes and bites this infected human. And when this mosquito comes and bites this infected human, all of these little malaria blood parasites are in the bloodstream, and it sucks up some of these little green and yellow parasites into the mosquito. And then this is essentially what's happening in the mosquito, okay? So you've got a lot of these things in the human bloodstream. Then there's transmission from the human bloodstream to the mosquito. Now let's look at what's going on in the mosquito, okay? So let's go to this stage right here, number 4. We're looking at, once again, this is happening inside of the mosquito. So you have these haploid gamete precursor cells, represented the yellow and green cells right here, where these are the sort of male ones and these are the sort of female ones, okay? And they produce gametes. But because these cells are already haploid, they produce these haploid gametes through mitosis. So meiosis isn't being used to create gametes here. Mitosis is being used to create gametes here. But these little swimmy things that you're looking at here represent sperm, and this thing is an egg cell that's developed by mitosis. And then the sperm will swim around in the mosquito and find an egg cell of the plasmodium, and you've got fertilization to make a zygote, okay? So now you've got these two haploid cells, the male sperm and the female egg, coming together to fertilize and make this diploid zygote. So fertilization is doubling your ploidy, from going from haploid cells to a single diploid cell. That's the zygote. And once again, this is inside the mosquito. And then that zygote, in this last step, will undergo meiosis. Okay, so it'll undergo meiosis in the mosquito. So remember, meiosis is going to get the diploid zygote into these haploid life stages. Okay, so these haploid life stages will then undergo mitosis to produce a whole bunch of themselves. Okay, so the zygote undergoes meiosis to make a bunch of these little haploid stages. These haploid stages will then go through mitosis a bunch of times to make hundreds and hundreds and thousands and even millions of copies of themselves inside of the mosquito. And then this mosquito will have a really bad infection that it can then spread back to the humans. And then we go back to essentially step 1, and this cycle repeats itself over and over and over again. Okay, so if that was a bit much for you to take and a little overwhelming to sort of take in, I just want to point out that there's some great animations that cover this if you're more of a visual learner. All you have to do is search YouTube, just type in HHMI malaria life cycle, and you can see the malaria life cycle in a mosquito at this link, but they'll just pop up once again in YouTube, and you can look at the separate video that shows the malaria life cycle in the human host. So I recommend checking out these videos just for review of what I just talked about. But the important things that I want you to draw from this plasmodium life cycle, which once again is representative of a haploid life cycle or a haploid dominant life cycle. Number 1, you should be able to identify where the diploid phase is. So go ahead and go through this life cycle and answer each of these questions. Where's the diploid, the haploid, where's fertilization, where's meiosis, where's mitosis occurring, and where is genetic variation introduced? Okay, so the diploid phase, you should have said, is in the mosquito. So there's only one very short-lived diploid phase, that's the zygote. All of these other life stages in the malaria life cycle are haploid, okay? So all of these other life stages here are haploid. A couple of things that I want to point out is, this word here, sporozoite and merozoite and oocyst and gametocytes and all that stuff like that, I would not expect you to memorize or know those terms. But what I do expect you to know is that these different life stages occur and which ones are haploid and which ones are diploid. So where is fertilization occurring? That's in the mosquito, and we see that stage right here. So remember, this is happening in the mosquito where you have these two haploid gametes coming together to fertilize to make the zygote. Where is meiosis occurring? That is also in the mosquito. So remember, after fertilization is when meiosis occurs. The zygote's very short-lived, and it makes this other life stage, this haploid life stage. And remember, meiosis is also where all the genetic variation and new mixing and new combinations of alleles will be made within the mosquito. When is mitosis occurring? Essentially every other stage. So anytime you're getting copies of these life stages, these life stages, these life stages, these life stages, any of these life stages, and even production of gametes, that's happening through mitosis. The only place where meiosis is occurring is right here. And where is genetic variation introduced? That is when meiosis and fertilization occur. So fertilization will have combinations of new alleles where you have the alleles that are present in the sperm and potentially different alleles that are present in the eggs combining. So that's mixing of new alleles. And then you'll have crossing over and independent assortment occurring during meiosis to create genetic variation. Okay, so as a reminder, this Plasmodium falciparum or malaria life cycle is a great example of a haploid dominant life cycle because it spends a very, very short time in this diploid stage. All of the other life stages where it spends the majority of its life are haploid life stages. And so this is a haploid dominant life cycle. So this is in contrast to what we see in humans and other animals, which is a diploid dominant life cycle. So humans spend the vast majority of their life as this diploid life stage and only a very short time as the haploid stage. Okay, so given everything that we've learned about mitosis and meiosis and also the malaria life cycle, which of the following are true? So this one's going to take some thinking. Okay, so if you said A, C, D, and E are true, that is correct. So given what we know about the life stage, mitosis increases the number of malarial parasites in the human bloodstream. That's absolutely right. So here we've got an infected liver cell. This life stage is this is a haploid life stage and making a bunch of copies through asexual reproduction and mitosis. And once again, that's going to infect the bloodstream. And then these life stages are reproducing inside the red blood cells, once again by mitosis. So mitosis increases the number of malaria parasites in the human bloodstream. Let's look at B. B says rates of meiosis directly affect the levels of malaria parasites in the human bloodstream. That is false. It is in fact mitosis. So if we look at the rates of malaria reproduction in the human bloodstream, this is all happening by mitosis. The only place where meiosis happens is over in the mosquito. And so that's not directly affecting reproductive rates and the destruction of red blood cells here in the human. This is all mitosis that's popping these red blood cells. Meiosis introduces more genetic variation into the malaria population than mitosis. So this is true in general of any population. So remember, mitosis can only introduce genetic variation via mutation, and that's a very, very rare event, whereas meiosis introduces it through mixing of different alleles, through independent assortment, through crossing over, okay? So meiosis is where genetic variation is introduced. D, higher rates of mitosis will increase the chances of malaria being transferred from humans to mosquitoes and vice versa. So this is a true statement. So basically the idea here is if you have more mitosis here, you have more malaria parasites in the bloodstream and higher chances that this mosquito here, when it comes and bites an infected human, because there's more of these little spores in the bloodstream, it has a higher probability of it getting transmitted from the human to the mosquito. And vice versa, there's a lot of mitotic reproduction going on here to make this life stage that gets transferred to the human. So the more of the mitosis that happens here, the higher the infection rate in this mosquito that initially bites a human, and the higher probability of transmission from this mosquito to the human and infecting the liver, okay? So more mitosis means more parasites in the human bloodstream and in the mosquito saliva, and that's higher chances of transmission. And then lastly, higher rates of meiosis will help the malaria parasite evolve to avoid treatment. So the idea here is when there's more meiosis, there's more genetic variation via independent assortment and crossing over. Therefore, you're combining alleles into new ways, which increases into new combinations, basically, which increases the chances of the malaria getting a new allele combination that will help it survive a potential treatment. Okay, so who gives a crap about any of this? Why are we spending all this time to learn about this particular life cycle in malaria? So basically, understanding this life cycle can help us understand and figure out ways to best treat the disease and potentially beat this really deadly pathogen. So, for example, there's benefits of targeting particular life stages in humans versus mosquitoes in terms of targeting genetic variability in malaria and sort of health outcomes in humans. So, for example, if you look at the life stages of malaria in humans, there's only mitosis going on there, and it's actually that mitotic reproduction that causes the red blood cells to explode, and that's what causes the sickness. And that also influences transmission rates from the human to the mosquito, the amount of parasite that's in the bloodstream, okay? Now, if we look at the life stages in the mosquitoes, that's where meiosis is going on, and that's where genetic variation is being created. And also, mitosis in the mosquitoes can affect rates of transmission to humans. So if you have a lot of the life stages reproducing in the saliva and getting into the saliva of the mosquitoes, that can influence transmission rates to humans, okay? So we've got a couple different things going on here. We've got sickness, we've got genetic variation, and we've got rates of transmission. So understanding the life stages and understanding the role of mitosis and meiosis and where those particular things in the life cycle of malaria occur can influence how we go about treating it. So it might influence targets for treatment. So for example, if your overall goal is to stop disease symptoms, it might make sense to reduce the destruction of blood cells, okay? Because remember, when the blood cells, red blood cells explode, this is when you get the actual disease, okay? And so maybe if you could reduce rates of mitosis in humans, you could slow down the actual disease progress. So you could stop the disease from happening. So this could be one potential pill that you might be able to develop is a treatment that slows down rates of mitosis and therefore reduces the destruction of blood cells. Let's say maybe your goal is to reduce the ability of malaria to evolve new traits to avoid treatments overall. Okay, so if you want to stop the ability of malaria to evolve new combinations of alleles, you want to reduce meiosis, and therefore you'd target life stages in the mosquito to reduce rates of meiosis. So you might develop a treatment that targets the mosquito or targets meiosis and the ability of the malaria to do meiosis. If your goal is to reduce overall transmission, then you might want to actually target rates of mitosis in either the humans or the mosquitoes. So you might develop a treatment that works on the cellular level to stop rates of mitosis or slow down rates of mitosis. Okay, so finally, which of the following is correct? All right, if you said none of the above, you are right. Animals do not have a haploid dominant life cycle, they have a diploid dominant life cycle. The diploid life stage dominates. Plasmodium does not have a diploid dominant life cycle, it has a haploid dominant life cycle. So it spends most of its life in the haploid stages and only exists in the diploid stage very briefly in the zygote stage. Plasmodium malaria produces gametes via meiosis. That is false. It produces its gametes via mitosis. So it has haploid cells that go through mitosis to produce egg and sperm. So they stay haploid. And animals produce gametes via mitosis. This is false. They produce it via meiosis. So cells in the testes of males that are diploid undergo meiosis to produce haploid sperm. Cells in the ovaries of females, these are diploid cells, go through meiosis to produce haploid eggs. So none of the above is the correct answer here.